some of the color tests that are used for color blindness, and we looked at a few optical illusions, looking at the perception of form. I wanted to just say a few words about the role of extrastriate or visual association cortex for perception of color. And there's some interesting studies that were described in your textbook, and hopefully that's all it goes. This fMRI study found evidence for a color-sensitive region that includes regions of the brain called the lingual and the fusiform gyri in the temporal cortex on the underside of the kind of the ventral surface of the brain. And they called that area V8. We saw V1 is primary visual cortex. V2 through V5 are also secondary visual association cortex or extrastriate cortex. And there's also this additional region called V8. Bouvier and Engel did a study, more recent study, and they looked at a bunch of cases of individuals who had what's called cerebral achromatopsia. Now, this is a form of color blindness, but it's related to brain damage or brain injury as opposed to a genetic defect in the cones of the eye. So these are acquired color blindness cases, people who have had stroke, for example, or brain injury. In this, particularly, they found this V8 region was involved in 92 cases of achromatopsia, and they localized those that damaged, again, to the lingual and the fusiform gyri. So it's interesting, we have some imaging evidence for the role of these two gyri, lingual and fusiform gyri, in color processing, and we also have lesion data or lesion studies that also clue us in to the fact that the lingual and the fusiform gyri are very important for color processing. Now, this is an interesting case of damage. There's also brain damage that's in your textbook, damage to the extrastriate cortex also, but this one resulted in loss of form perception but not color perception. And so as a result of this damage, you can actually see on the axial, this is an axial image of the damage, and here you can see, well, here's a sagittal view and more of a coronal view, but you can see the very, very large area of atrophy, which is quite abnormal. And that area involved extrastriate cortex, and both the structural and functional MRI data show that this particular patient can see incoming visual information. That is, the primary visual cortex is active in processing the visual image, but he's able to correctly identify the color of the image, but he can't perceive the form or the shape of the stimulus. So again, it's another testament to the role of extrastriate cortex, not only in the processing of color, but also in the processing of form. So speaking of the perception of form, visual information analysis regarding form really starts with neurons in the striate cortex. That's V1, primary visual cortex. It's sensitive to orientation of lines as well as to spatial frequency. And when we talk about spatial frequency, we're talking about the variation in brightness measured in cycles per degree of visual angle. And this is a square wave grading where we have all dark, then all light, then all dark, and then all light. So the changes in brightness go from low, very low, to very high. The sine wave grading has more gradual changes in brightness, as you can see here. That's what makes them a little bit blurry. That blurriness is that those changes in brightness from going from very light to very dark. And so the spatial frequency of an image is then measured in terms of its variation in brightness in cycles per degree of visual angle, which involves the distance between the eye and the image And there's also a function, I think it's the arctangent or something like that, that is involved in calculating that angle. So these neurons in the striate cortex, particularly sensitive to orientation and/or spatial frequency, send information to area V2 and then on to the ventral stream of extrastriate cortex and the visual information and more of the what system. Again, the ventral stream of information, the ventral visual stream is that what stream, and the dorsal stream is the where stream, and helps us to identify objects, in this case perceive form, going through the ventral stream of the extrastriate cortex, and there's also neurons that would send information about where that object or form was located in the environment. This is a very famous photograph of Abraham Lincoln, and these two images contain exactly the same amount of low-frequency information, and it's sort of the blurriness. And from the back of the room, these probably look very close or almost identical. But on the right, we have this image that has had the very high spatial frequencies filtered from the picture. A high spatial frequency is one that has very well-defined edges and contours, and low spatial frequency has less defined or more blurry contours. So this would be an example of a very high spatial frequency superimposed upon the low spatial frequencies, and here they've filtered off the high spatial frequencies. But from a distance, you kind of lose the high spatial frequencies anyway, and the two images start to look about the same. In terms of processing form, when we look at deficits that we see neuropsychologically associated with problems in the visual association cortex, we have a condition called visual agnosia. And visual agnosia involves deficits in visual perception in the absence of blindness. And again, it's caused by a deficit or degradation of functioning in a particular brain region. So people who have visual agnosia oftentimes are not able to identify specific objects. They might be able to tell you how the object's used. They might be able to tell you the category of the object, but they can't tell you the name of the object. And in more severe cases, we see greater difficulty with recognizing the function or even the category of the object. There's a specific type of agnosia called prosopagnosia, which involves a failure to recognize particular people by the sight of their faces. And so people who have had strokes in these particular areas, especially this fusiform face area, they have a difficulty recognizing otherwise familiar individuals, and the only way that they can tell people apart is by the sound of their voice oftentimes. Yes?
Is there other causes for that, or just brain damage? Because I knew someone with Asperger's who had this issue, who couldn't recognize people's faces and really see the whole as a face.
Yeah, sure. So I think possibly that could be related to a developmental difficulty in that the fusiform face area. That I'm less familiar with the neuropsychology of autism, but certainly developmentally, some of the brain regions supporting these processes could be not as well developed, or could have had a problem in the stages of development that would account for that. So looking at some of the key players in terms of analyzing visual information, we have something called the lateral occipital complex, or LOC, and this is part of the extrastriate cortex, or secondary visual cortex, involved in perception of objects other than people's bodies and faces. So these are, in this region, this would become particularly active during perceptions of objects other than people's faces and bodies. So more objects. The fusiform face area is one that is well known, and it's a region of visual association cortex, again on the ventral surface of the brain and the inferior temporal cortex, and that's involved in perceiving faces as well as other complex objects that require expertise to recognize. And as we'll see, even headless bodies sometimes can increase activity in this particular area. There's yet another area called the extrastriate body area, and this particular region of visual association cortex is involved in perception of the human body and body parts other than faces. Would probably show some activation or increase in response to a face, but its major responsiveness would be to the human body and body parts. And this is located in the lateral occipital temporal cortex, so right in the junction between the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe. And then in addition to an area specialized for faces, we have an area specialized for places, faces and places. So the parahippocampal place area, or PPA, is an area of limbic cortex on the medial temporal lobe, and that's involved in perception of particular places or scenes. And this is a study from described in your textbook showing the relative responsiveness of particular objects, particularly the fusiform face area and the extrastriate body area, which were activated. Fusiform face area, not surprisingly, most of the activity seen in response to faces. And as you can see, not so much with body parts or assorted objects. A little bit of responsiveness to headless bodies. Probably the body's or the brain's, tendency to try to fill in a face, maybe, or conjure up a face to put on the headless body. In contrast, the extrastriate body area shows the greatest activity in response to the headless bodies as well as to body parts. And so that's essentially how it got its name, an extrastriate body area. So very cool, very interesting that certain regions of the brain in the visual association cortex respond maximally to very specific or discrete types of stimuli. And this is an example again in your textbook showing the parahippocampal place area. We have an activation of the parahippocampal cortex in a patient in response to viewing scenes. So again, very active, and this is the same parahippocampal place region in response to viewing scenes in a control subject. Even so, this woman had bilateral damage to the lateral occipital cortex, so she couldn't really recognize objects. She had a visual object agnosia, but she could recognize both natural and human-made scenes like a beach, forest, cities, markets, and rooms. And so this shows that her parahippocampal place area was intact, even though her lateral occipital cortex was damaged. Stephen?
So then, if she's sold to, if she's shown a picture of a store, right, and you point to the picture as a whole and you ask her what it is, she says it's a store, right? But if you point to like a register and on the picture and you ask her what that is, she wouldn't be able to.
Exact.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this is an image of the fusiform gyrus, and kind of making the point that there's a developmental process associated with each of these brain regions. This is showing the ventral surface of the brain, the underside of the brain essentially, on the left of an 8-year-old child, and on the right for an adult, and shows the regions of the fusiform gyrus that responded to the sight of faces. You can see that there's a little response in the 8-year-old in that particular region, but a much greater response in the adult. And so again, that suggests that experience really is important for increasing the responsiveness of these various brain regions of extrastriate cortex to respond optimally to specific stimuli. All right, so that brings us to the end of the visual system. Any questions